Our government's identified the top 30 gender-based violence hotspots in its efforts to respond to what's been described as the second pandemic. Police Minister Bekele revealed that rape, human trafficking for sexual offences, kidnapping for sexual offences and domestic-related human trafficking cases were considered. In addition, figures of reported domestic violence cases of murder, rape, attempted murder and assault were also taken into account. I'm joined by Lisa Vetten, who's a PhD fellow at the Wits City Institute. Lisa, good evening. When you look at the criteria that has been used to put together this list of 30, is it a fair reflection of what is happening in the country right now?
I think it's important that the police are taking new and different steps to think about how they address the problem. However, I'm not sure the way they've gone about it is really going to get them closer to solving the problem. I think it's quite important to separate out some of these crimes because they don't all have the same sets of causes. So when you lump them together, you lose that fact and you run the risk of perhaps doing things that are going to be ineffective. So, for example, where you have a high rate of stranger rape, for example, you can't police that in the same way where you have a high rate of domestic violence. Because if you have a high rate of domestic violence, it means you've got to be policing inside people's homes, which is not possible. Whereas policing outside, where a great deal of strange rape happens, could be more effective. So I think the police are going to be needing to nuance their thinking quite significantly. And they're also going to have to start thinking about how do they take the underreporting of these crimes into account. Because we know that both rape and domestic violence have very low rates of reporting to the police.
One of the important things that you've mentioned there, Lisa, is really the ability to identify what the real problem is, because the solution needs to be targeted towards that. How are police officers or the police service going to be capacitated to better do that? What do they need?
I don't think they've been able to do that at all, because it's one thing to identify a place where a lot of crime is being reported. It's quite a different thing to say, why is there such an incidence of rape in this area and not, say, in the police station next door? What is unique and specific to this particular geographical area? And I haven't seen that kind of analysis being offered. So if you can't say what are the conditions that are causing this increase in these areas, then you obviously cannot come up with the kind of diagnostic conditions in order to be able to address that. And if I look at some of those areas, some of them are in areas that also report high levels of gang violence. Some of them are in areas where there is no gang activity. So it is also trying to say that perhaps there are different dynamics going on in particular areas that push up crimes of rape, for example, but are not present in other areas. So again, there's a need for a much deeper and more subtle level of analysis if we're going to do hotspot policing.
When we look at that list of 30, a significant portion, a disappropriate number of those listed actually come from the Western Cape. Does that mean that the Western Cape has a bigger problem of gender-based violence than other provinces in the country?
Well, you see, this is, I think, the other major problem with the way that the hotspots have been identified. They haven't taken into account the size of a population. So you might find that some areas have a higher number of rapes simply because they have a much bigger population size. So you would expect there to be a greater number of rapes being reported there. So this kind of hotspot identification to some extent rules out the recognition of violence that might be happening in small peri-urban and rural areas simply because their population isn't as big. So I think that's another problem that the police have to be looking at. I think Gauteng, Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape keep coming up, and those are the four most populous provinces. So again, it suggests that they haven't properly taken population size into account in identifying which areas are hotspots.
Well, the compilation of this data, Lisa, and if we just listen to part of what you've said, is clearly flawed. You know, there's a lot of ways in which it can be improved. But with this information that we have, do you think that there's anything that the police can be doing differently within these areas to try and address gender-based violence?
Certainly, and I think one of the things they have identified themselves as going to do, and that is to put up specialized desks or make sure that there are specialized officers at those stations to ensure that there is better reception of women when they go and report. I think that's very positive. Obviously, one would like them to do that in every station in the country, but clearly they need to be prioritizing there at this point in time. I think what they also need to be doing is looking at those stations and seeing how well they do in relation to complying with the Domestic Violence Act. So Delft, for example, which they've identified as station number 1, repeatedly appears in the reports to Parliament as a station that does not comply very well with the Domestic Violence Act. So I think they could target those stations for extra training to see how they're complying with their administrative duties, to see if they're linked up with shelters and other counselling services in order to provide a better service. So I think the identification of those hotspots, while it may not necessarily result in a reduction in those crimes, it could lead to much better policing responses. And that is important, given how many women still experience secondary victimization when they report to the police.
Domestic violence seems to be one of the areas where police officers, in fact, are simply not faring well due to this attitude of how they respond when people come to report incidents of domestic violence and subsequently what should happen thereafter.
I missed part of what you asked, Cathy, so I hope I'm guessing correctly what you may have been asking. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that the police could be doing. Is the first, they could be looking at the reports and the copies of the protection orders that they receive. And they could, I think if they start to analyze them and use them as information, they could start to see who is potentially at high risk, whose partner is a repeat offender, who is dangerous, and that could help them to prioritize which households they need to give extra special and particular attention to, and which households they need to link with the courts for protection orders, as well as to hospitals and to shelters where safety is needed. So I think they could be analyzing the information that they get in order to better identify who is at high risk and who needs to be responded to as a priority when a call of domestic violence comes in. You know, I think there'd be other things that could be done, which the Department of Justice needs to step up to, I think, and take control of this. And that's to start make it compulsory for every case of domestic, where a woman dies and there was a protection order at the time that she had. They need to look at those cases and institute an inquiry to find out why those women died. Because those are women who came to the attention of the police and the court and said, I'm in danger, please help me, and they still died. And we need to understand what better policing options and other legal protections need to be put in place to protect those women. So I think there's more innovative things they could be thinking about to draw on the information they do have to provide better forms of safety.